The Bloodstream podcast is made possible by Takeda and is intended for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only. Please consult with professionals before making any healthcare decisions.
Boy, we have a stupid healthcare system. I mean, it's a mess. And, the Affordable Care Act fixed a couple of the problems like that, but there's just so many things that are a problem now.
That voice belongs to Dr. Mike Callahan, a pediatric hematologist and expert on hemophilia and sickle cell disease, and one half of the Cheat Codes Sickle Cell podcast. He joins me later to discuss Sickle Cell Awareness Month, that is September, the FDA's ruling on gene therapy last month, August, and a recent article published by a group of adult men all born with hemophilia, all highly active in the community, expressing urgent skepticism for the scientific vigor and transparency of some gene therapy clinical trials taking place. It's super interesting, and Dr. Mike and I get into it during the interview. Today we're also going to talk about ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, and a recent publication of theirs. NHF, they're seeking input on their Blue Sky initiative, and we'll tell you how you can help inform the future of the bleeding disorders community. And a big win for bleeding disorders advocates in Texas. We will touch on that as well, before diving into the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and what that means for the future of the Supreme Court, and most immediately, the Affordable Care Act. All that coming up today on Bloodstream. But hey, before I get too far ahead, hello and welcome to the Bloodstream Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick James Lynch, alongside Believe Limited's Director of Outreach, Amy Board. Hi, Amy.
Hello, everybody.
And my pregnant doula wife, Miss Natalie Rose. Hello, Natalie.
Hello.
So, lots to get to. Big story, of course, the Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing last week, which is sad amongst many other things, certainly a national moment, and procedurally, it calls into question a whole bunch of stuff, including the strength of the Affordable Care Act, which is facing a challenge before the Supreme Court of either 8 or 9 justices on November 10th, just after the election. Yeah! Nat, Amy, and I have gathered various stories written on this. I mean, my goodness, 2020, your ability to top yourself is extraordinary. And we're going to go through some of the articles that we've read, what this might mean for the Affordable Care Act in just a little bit. But before we do that, a couple fun announcements to make, the first of which is I'm doing a drum roll, but silently, just with my fingers, so that I don't screw up the audio. But it's, you do it too?
I'll do it too.
Okay, Natalie's doing it. It's like spirit fingers. It's, thanks, guys. Appreciate
it. It is
support.
spirit fingers. It's like the spirit finger emoji.
It is. It's exactly like that. And we're doing this because the Pain Podcast has been renewed for a second season. Woot, woot.
Woo, woo.
So yes, the Pain Pod, a podcast we're very proud of, released the first season earlier this year, has been renewed by Tremo Pharmaceuticals. Shout out to Tremo Pharmaceuticals, TremoRx.com to learn more. And they have decided to go forward with us on a second season, which is going to take a slightly different focus. So for those of you who listened to season 1, and by the way, if you didn't, bloodstreammedia.com, or look up the Pain Podcast on your favorite podcast player, but it might be easier to just go to Bloodstream Media.
Like, just to give it a little shout, I think it's one of the best things that has come out of Bloodstream Media. It's tremendous. And the fact that there's going to be season 2 is just tremendous. It's such an important conversation. And anyway, so hats off. Hats off to the team, and hats off to Tremo.
Thanks, Bordeaux. Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to somebody from the team earlier about like how the Pain Podcast specifically has been something that for them has been an actual resource. So it's like something that came out of the company that they're like, I've been using that for a resource. And it's like, yeah, they're not resources for us just because we make them, right? So totally. The second season will, our first season was really guided by a lot of expert insight, experts in pain. The second season is going to be built more so around the patient story and really looking at these patient odysseys. Odyssey is a word that seems to come up a lot in patient stories, and using those to drive the stories and experiences of the show. So stay tuned for more on that. This just happened, so that's literally the amount of detail that I have for you. But if you know of someone with a pain odyssey worth sharing, feel free to let us know. Mailbag at bloodstreammedia.com. And one other quick announcement, too. We've talked a bit about Stop the Bleeding, plenty, actually. But there was something this past week, a conversation with somebody who's been in the community a long time, about the importance of getting back to some of the basics in hemophilia and self-care. And I know I can tend to take certain things for granted or overlook the importance of something that maybe I learned, 4 or 5 years ago. So I forget that not everybody learned it 4 or 5 years ago. And it dawned on me, we have this amazing 8-minute demonstration of how to safely and thoroughly account for a self-infusion no matter where you are. That was part of our Stop the Bleeding Camp I Don't Want to Bleed Goes Virtual, Camp From Anywhere season this season. But Hope Woodcock-Ross, an RN in our community, along with an actual patient camper, Zach, go through the steps of self-infusion. And shout out to both of them, but shout out to Hope especially for really kind of metering out every little piece and asking all the probing questions to get Zach to describe why he's doing what he's doing. It's super informative. And if I'm going to be honest, which I guess I'm going to be, there were a number of points made during the demo that I either forgot about or did not ever learn in the first place. So if I learned something from it, then I think probably most people will. So we'll put a link in the program notes or stbhemo.com. But because we have such a top-notch operation over here, we're going to provide you with a little audio tease from the STB Infusion segment. And here it is. Here is the audio tease from the STB Infusion segment.
All right, so what are you going to do first after you clean your hands?
So now I'm going to mix my factor.
So do you store your factor in the refrigerator or outside?
Typically in a refrigerator.
You can always check in with your hemophilia treatment center or your nurse there. They can let you know what the guidelines are. There is a temperature guide on the side of each box of factor too, what it should be stored at. So do you clean the stopper on top of your factor bottle?
Yes.
So what are you doing now?
So I'm popping the tops off of my vials that contain the dried factor product, and then I take a alcohol swab to clean the tops of them.
So if you were traveling, like when you normally come to camp during the summer, how do you bring your factor to camp?
I bring them in plastic bags to keep them clean.
Do you usually have them in a cooler when you bring them or just on the seat of the car?
Oh yeah, I usually keep them in a cooler with ice packs.
So again, you can watch the infusion episode or any episode of Stop the Bleeding at stbhemo.com.
And there's a whole season that just came out, and if I'm being completely transparent, I haven't seen it yet because we've been in Ohio with my family, but I'm really excited to watch the new season as well.
Well, I also become like a child when you're like, oh, do you want to watch one of the episodes? I'm like, no, I'm good. I don't want to. You can watch it on your own time. I have to go do something else. But that's enough on all of that. So we do have a lot to get to. I'll keep us moving. The Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, more commonly referred to as ICER, they tend to publish things every once in a while that get professionals and clinicians, not necessarily patient advocates, but people on some of the other sides of the table, they pay a lot of attention to what happens with ICER. So Amy, I know this stuff can be super dense. Can you give us just like a little overview of like ICER and what it is they do and why it's relevant to the community?
Sure. Basically, it just like you said, it's an independent research organization, but it's a watchdog on drug pricing. So the group is a nonpartisan research organization. It evaluates all of the different entities that would make up drug pricing and how it would both benefit the healthcare system and the patients. They actually do convene stakeholders, so there is public comment. There's room for public comment on every single paper that is put out. And I do believe some, private insurers, government officials, policymakers, and I think advocate groups can be involved in the actual research evaluation. I have to get back to you on that to make sure that's legit. But they actually just released a report, a white paper, comparing Hemlibra and BioMarin's gene therapy drug for hemophilia A.
Interesting.
And so it's in the process. And this review obviously took place believing that the BioMarin product would be approved here in August. And of course, we know that the FDA submitted language that not yet. We're going to have to wait a little bit, probably another 2.5 years before that comes to fruition. So this paper is, I think, a good starting point to discuss the drug pricing. To be completely transparent, we had high hopes of discussing this today, just a little bit to tell you what was going to be in there, and the paper's super dense and I couldn't figure it out. I'll be honest, I'm not an expert on this, so to make sure that you guys understand. I think we're going to discuss it in a later podcast. We're going to get somebody who was involved in the creation of this report, many familiar names. So they're not, picking names out of nowhere for this, very familiar names. So we're going to get somebody to discuss the outcomes because it's a very thorough report, as you can imagine. And I think it's interesting. It's going to be an interesting discussion as the gene therapy products that are coming out have not been priced yet. And this might influence some of that pricing, which is a very big deal for not only our patients, but our systems that keep our way of treatment in the hemophilia community alive. So anyway, it's kind of cool, and be on the lookout for that. We're gonna get somebody on the podcast who can actually discuss it, so you don't have to hear me discuss it.
I wonder too, given that the timeline changed for a lot of projections around gene therapy and hemophilia, I wonder if there will be other gene therapy treatments that are approved ahead of one for hemophilia that force the payer and payment reimbursement conversation along in a way that we haven't anticipated. I actually hadn't thought about that until just now. So that'll be something interesting to kind of keep an eye on as well. What does get approval from the FDA between now and when there is a hemophilia gene therapy drug, and how will that impact pricing, access, protocols, et cetera? Although all of that could be thrown for quite a loop if the ACA is overturned, which we will get to in just a little bit. But, did you guys know that the Bloodstream podcast is made possible by our presenting sponsor, Takeda? Did you know that?
I knew it. Nat, did you know that?
By who?
That's by Takeda. And if you'd like to learn more about Takeda and their commitment to the bleeding disorders community, you can go to this website, bleedingdisorders.com. Did you catch that? It's bleedingdisorders.com. Another interesting publication the community should be aware of, the National Hemophilia Foundation published something on September 15th, is what I'm looking at here on their website, article titled NHF is Charting a Course for the Future. So they have been working with a group of over 100 different patient advocates, clinicians, various experts, KOLs, and people in the community. Full disclosure, I'm one of those people, and on what's called the Blue Sky Project. And the Blue Sky Project is NHF's initiative to both chart the future immediately, which of course is a bit challenging as we're still in this COVID era, but also our future over the course of the next 10 years. And I'm emphasizing this because I know many of us can be frustrated at times that our voices are not heard, that things are not happening in the way that we believe they should. I was a part of at least one Facebook thread yesterday where, how our national organizations are or are not representing us was a topic of vigorous discussion. So here it is. Here's a great opportunity, if you're willing to set aside a little bit of time to make comments on this plan, to get your voice in there and help determine the future of research and activity from the National Hemophilia Foundation. So again, this is their Blue Sky initiative. There's info on their website. There is a link in the program notes. I cannot emphasize enough how valuable an opportunity this is to make sure that your priorities, your experiences are understood and appreciated by the organization most in charge of protecting our community. So please follow the links in the program notes and get your voice in there.
And Patrick, can I ask a question? Is it just patients, or is it caregivers? Is it like the nucleus around the patient? So can Natalie fill it out? Can grandparents fill it out? Is it one of those things that they want to get a broad view of what it's like to have hemophilia in your orbit? Is that true?
Yes.
Von Willebrand's disease?
Yes. So think about the most inclusive definition of bleeding disorders community. So if you're listening to this, chances are you qualify, as might a loved one or two. So it's the most broad definition. Get your voice in there.
Yeah.
And this initiative was born before COVID, and this has been something that has been talked about for a while, right?
Yes, that's correct. And then obviously COVID changed everybody's everything. So I think the initiative was kind of broken into a more immediate short term, how are we responding to this moment and the needs, in parallel to a 10-year vision that we're building toward, and not considering COVID too much in that part of the strategic planning. So yeah, it started beforehand, and then adapted like the rest of us to include a COVID track.
Well, yeah, and it's funny to have something right now where everything's kind of crazy. We called a blue sky initiative because I think for most people right now, it's not feeling very blue sky. But good on
Fair.
NHF, and I'm glad that the initiative's being taken with a decade ahead look.
Yeah, cheers to that. Okay, and so just before now we talk about the vacancy on the Supreme Court, the Affordable Care Act, and the activity that will have the Affordable Care Act up in front of the Supreme Court yet again in November. We have a nice advocacy win to discuss that actually, interestingly enough, the case that's in front of the Supreme Court or going in front of the Supreme Court is Texas verse because it's from a Texas case. The details we'll get to in a minute. Here we have some more encouraging, specific community-friendly news about advocacy work taking place in Texas. Amy, what's going on?
Well, apparently, there was kind of a funding snafu in the Texas state legislature that they wanted to take a bunch of community protected funding streams. They wanted to take those away to fund something else. And there was an advocacy fight to make sure that those stayed within the patient communities. And that is true. So Texas kind of reversed its plan. It was $15 million towards these very specific health programs that was going to be cut and obviously moved somewhere else. And so now they can stay with those health programs. But the thing that I was so excited to hear, obviously hemophilia has a chunk of money in that program, but my love of advocacy actually came from my advocacy crush on Brendan Hayes, who's the executive director of the Dallas chapter at the time, who actually took that chunk of money that was utilized for some other things in the hemophilia community. Basically, it was just kind of a dormant funding stream. And she, after the ACA was actually passed through, she actually took that money and lobbied for about a year and a half, 2 years to turn it into an assistance fund for the hemophilia community in Texas. It was a huge win. It was a big deal. She had to hire a lobbyist. She had to hire a team. It actually created a policy giant in her as well. She actually now works for the National Hemophilia Foundation. She is a policy director there, and she spearheads their gene therapy programs. And I loved watching her fight. It was such a clear fight. Funding fights are so clear in the eyes of policymakers in terms of making an actual difference for the people that have hemophilia and von Willebrand's in the state of Texas. So the fact that there was a threat there that program could actually go away, it was just a very cool thing to see. So congratulations to the 2 Texas chapters for all of their work that I'm sure they were very much involved in. It's a cool story.
$15 million is a lot of money. And
it is a lot of money. And that didn't go obviously all to hemophilia. There were other funds, but yeah, it was a part of that. The Hemophilia Assistance Fund, and it was, it was listed in some of our articles that we read about it, which is really cool.
Child advocacy programs, comprehensive rehab services, early childhood intervention, respite epilepsy, family violence, mobile stroke unit, umbilical cord, bank funding, women's health, and local intellectual and developmental disability authorities. So quite a number of specific health and social needs that were served by this $15 million that fortunately was protected.
Yeah, and it just goes to show that when you're a human that is in charge of like a government budget and you see 15 million and you have a deficit on some other, or it needs to go towards COVID services and those types of things, it's really easy to just be like, oh my gosh, no one uses these health, these are very marginalized health or whatever their reasoning was to just, make a cut, and how important it is to have advocacy members on the ground that see that, make public comment, and lobby against it to show officials, no, this helps a certain amount of people, please keep it here. So
right.
If everyone's feeling, fatigued advocacy-wise, I totally get it. It goes up and down, but things like this, it's very important to stay informed and to be at the ready when something like this gets threatened.
Another reason I don't think the community's going anywhere, because things like this are going to always come up and we're going to always have to deal with them.
Totes.
All right, so let's move into our big topic for today. But first, I have to remind you that, well, not remind you, I haven't really let you know yet, so I can't remind you of something I haven't first told you about. So let me first tell you about it, and then I'll remind you later that this month, our segment sponsor for this segment is Genentech, who's continuing to support the hemophilia community through their site, GenentechHemophilia.com. I like the easy websites to remember. Thank you to everybody making these website decisions. There, you can watch 2 great new videos, both from the home reunion episodes of Challenge Accepted, featuring the community members from Season 1, and of course, Justin Willman. You guys know Justin Willman. We've talked about him before. Comedian and magician. Doesn't say it in this copy, but I know it because I've read the previous copy. They've also added a brand new edition of The Edge, Genentech's biannual newsletter, which shines a light on those in the hemophilia community who refuse to let their bleeding disorder limit them. Each issue of The Edge offers a look into unique aspects of the community and individual stories from all walks of life. Visit GenentechHemophilia.com or click the link in the program notes. So, Friday, we got some difficult news, not totally unexpected for those following the news cycle. It was announced not too long ago that Ruth Bader Ginsburg's cancer had returned and spread, and so it did seem as though the 87-year-old titan of the courts was not too much longer for this earth. As stated in the intro, there are a number of different things this means. Of course, someone's no longer with us, and that's not to be lost in all of the discussion around what it means. But for our purposes, there is a challenge to the Affordable Care Act that is coming in front of the Supreme Court on November 10th. The Supreme Court, as of today, has 8 justices without Justice Ginsburg. We'll get into it in a moment. There's a potential that there will be 9 justices. There's a potential there'll only be 8 justices. And there's a potential for a number of different outcomes. Fortunately, Amy, Natalie, and I, what do we split up, like 10 articles crew? And we did our best to sort of read through as many different, I got something from Kaiser News. What's this over here? Healthaffairs.org. This actually is a great one. So we tried to get a wide range of input so that this isn't too, slanted or narrow, a discussion about the Affordable Care Act in this new era of the courts. So I'll pause there, and Amy, maybe we'll start with you. Anything that you just want to comment on or kind of kick off with in thinking about this story? And then after that, Natalie, of course, same to you.
Well, on a personal note, I spent the weekend. Her death was one of those blows that made me turn inward a little bit. I actually got off social media for a while just to kind of reflect, because it affected me in a way that I wasn't quite prepared that it was going to. And I just, I don't know, maybe this is just a therapeutic thing for me, but I just wanted to mention I was a single woman for a long, long, long time. And one of the things that I think I put words to this past weekend, but I think one of the things I will be most proud of when I leave this earth is that I was able, as a single woman, to buy a house in Colorado and to live as, an independent woman for as long as I did, and knowing that I could for the rest of my life. There was something very empowering about that, and it was such a gift to be able to do that. And I wouldn't have been able to do that without Ruth Bader Ginsburg leading the fight, and how radical that was back in the day, that a woman could be on a mortgage all alone as an independent woman. And so for that, I am just internally grateful. And
you say back in the day, but the things she changed were set in place just a few years before we were born. Some of the mortgage, opening a credit card without a male signator, I think that was changed in 1978. So back in the day is not like that long ago.
100%. 100%. And I was so, I don't know, as I was reflecting, And this will get into, the ACR conversation about the ACA. It was such a radical thing. I mean, it was opposed fiercely and people just couldn't fathom. And it was not only a political thing, but it was very much kind of a discussion of popular politics. And so some of these radical things that we are discussing and debating and fighting over right now are things that hopefully in 20, 30 years time, someone will be on a podcast and be like, I can't believe this was debated.
Hey listeners, Patrick here, and I'm so sorry. Right around this time, my and Natalie's equipment died unbeknownst to us. So unfortunately, the remainder of our audio is not quite as crisp as it is thus far, although the conversation with Dr. Mike is with good audio. So it's going to change, but for a little while here, it's going to be suboptimal. I hope it doesn't distract you from this really important segment on the ACA and the Supreme Court, and I'm going to work hard to make sure that does not happen again, at least not anytime soon. All right, back to the segment.
So hopefully. So I just wanted to say it selfishly. I don't know. I just wanted to say that, I wasn't a diehard fan per se. I have several girlfriends that were, and that text thread on Friday night was great and not sober. Oh my goodness. And not that it was just very, so I guess I'm saying this not as, someone who necessarily idolized her, but someone who just on a pure woman to woman level, it's a really big deal, and I am very grieved and hope to honor her. So I just wanted to say that before we get into this conversation. So I guess I'll throw it over to Nat.
Yeah, I do know that I forget her name, Amy, I believe, who Trump has the forerunner for his nominee, is literally the antithesis of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She belongs to a very weird Catholic group that believes that husbands should rule over wives. Literally all the things that Ruth stood for, her potential replacement is the antithesis of. So without going deep down that rabbit hole and bringing it back to how her death not only is culturally significant, but significant and could jeopardize something that's really important for our community. So Patrick had said November 10th is when this is coming up. And this is the third time this has come up in the Supreme Court. Why is it such a big deal right now? So we split up about 10 articles. I read an article that was put out by Vox, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And then, I don't know, I'm sure you have all seen it by now, but those charts that get published every year that show where media lands in terms of left, center, right, and right. So Vox is left, Washington Post is left, and Wall Street Journal is center. So I got some center and left view here that I read. And even just in the titles, you can see the difference between what something that's further from center says to provoke a little bit of fear. And then, the Wall Street Journal, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death puts a spotlight on the Affordable Care Act. And that seems like a very neutral title. And why does that matter? As Patrick said, we are coming down to with the death, there's 8 justices. And November 10th, even if another justice was brought in, there is a precedent that they can't, I gotta find it. But basically, if there was a new justice, unless they push back do you know what it's called?
I don't know what it's called, but I, in my reading, came upon mention that when Brett Kavanaugh was appointed, his appointment took place, he had to miss the first couple of days of opening arguments or oral arguments. And if you do, then you can't participate in that case. So I think
Correct.
He something like 5 or 6 cases. I think he maybe didn't even listen to most of the cases in his first sitting as a justice. So yeah, there is a timeline sensitivity piece to this. There's a lot of pieces to this, and that is one of them.
Yeah, so the precedent is if you have not taken part in oral arguments, you cannot participate in the vote.
Correct.
But they also are saying that oral arguments could be pushed back. So that's another way it could go to get all 9 justices to participate in this decision. And then also, it's just helpful to kind of read about this too. Obviously, this kind of stuff we talk about a lot on the podcast and it comes up. But every time this comes back up, I become personally more clear on what the power the Supreme Court has in these decisions and how that affects all of us. So if, historically, Justice John Roberts has voted with the liberal side in regards to the ACA. And even if he does this time and it's a 4-4 split, it gives the lower courts, they become in charge, so their rulings will hold. So in order to get this to go away, we need more than him to decide that this is a garbage lawsuit.
So interestingly, to zoom out a little bit, and we even, I believe, Natalie, talked about this very case when it was last in front of the Court of Appeals, whenever that was, and that case resolved, and it's going to the Supreme Court. I remember us saying that was likely to be, and here we are. But just for some context, so California versus Texas, more commonly referred to as just Texas in this context. Texas is at the heart about the individual mandate. The plaintiffs argue that Congress rendered the mandate unconstitutional in 2017 when it changed the mandate's penalty to $0 in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Without a monetary penalty, the plaintiffs argue, the mandate can no longer be sustained as an exercise of Congress's taxing power, and it's now unconstitutional. Because the mandate is, quote, essential, and this is where we get into it, to the rest of the Affordable Care Act, the argument goes the entire law should fall alongside it. I should give credit where it's due that what I just read is from a writer and attorney named Katie Keith that was published in healthaffairs.org. And of what I read, Natalie, I don't know where Health Affairs is on the biases graph, but I will say this was a very, she explains a lot. So this was my favorite read, and there was a couple other things that she made clear that I want to point out. So that piece about essential, one of the words that's used in the courts is severability. And one of the big questions is, can you sever this piece of the ACA, the mandate, get rid of that and allow the rest of the bill to uphold? It's yes or no. And then there's another road as well. And the next road is that it could be identified that there are other pieces of the Affordable Care Act that are intertwined innately with the mandate, and therefore they too are unconstitutional and need to be done away with, but are also severable from the larger bill itself. So that's another possible outcome, that both the mandate and some other provisions, and unfortunately, one of the most likely provisions, if this outcome is to take place, is the protections for people with pre-existing conditions, become severable. Interesting to note, Justice Kavanaugh, who was appointed very famously during the Trump administration and is a conservative justice, he has given a couple of rulings, or either rulings or has voiced dissent in such a way that suggests he might actually be in favor of upholding the Affordable Care Act in this particular case, having said things in courts previously, such as, quote, decisive preference for surgical severance rather than wholesale destruction, and that, quote, constitutional litigation is not a game of gotcha against Congress where litigants can ride a discrete constitutional flaw in a statute to take down the whole. He also described the court's approach to severability as, quote, constitutional, stable, predictable, and commonsensical, with preference for, quote, a scalpel rather than a bulldozer in order to avoid, quote, a major regulatory disruption. So let's be clear. If come November 10th, the Affordable Care Act is wholesale deemed to be unconstitutional as a result of Texas, immediately the Affordable Care Act is no longer the law of the land. Tens of millions of people lose their health insurance during a MF and pandemic, during which we've got another couple 100,000 people with pre-existing conditions called COVID. So it would be a major regulatory disruption to overturn the entirety of the Affordable Care Act days after an election when you've just had one of the Supreme Court justices pass away. Like, there's not a clearer picture that I can paint of what a major disruption could look like. And if it weren't for watching Justice Kavanaugh on television and listening to him talk and just not feeling like he's someone I trust at all, I would feel very encouraged by this, because between Chief Justice Roberts, as was, I forget, maybe Natalie, you mentioned it, someone mentioned he has previously ruled in favor with the Affordable Care Act and upholding it. So the hope is that perhaps Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh would both be inclined to support upholding the ACA, or at the very least sending back down to the lower courts this decision around severability to come back with. However, this is a year of, I mean, this has been years in a row of like, well, that feels like what should happen or shouldn't happen. However, so my hope and what this, again, Katie Keith in this article, which she sort of leads with, which I thought at first was like, well, you're a little optimistic for me. But by the end, as she explained all this, it did actually give me a little bit more hope that even if there is not another justice, which I hope there is not, appointed, and this case comes before the Supreme Court of 8 on November 10th, it's not outside the realm of possibility that Chief Justice Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh rule in favor of protecting it, and it is upheld 5-3. So it's not as grim as I had originally thought, at least from her perspective. And appreciating some of these nuances, I can understand why.
That was my take as well, is that the legal arguments for overturning and throwing the entire bill out because of this one section it's not strong per se. However, who knows? I think another aspect of this that is troubling and requires attention is Congress, the Republican-led Senate in particular, and the Trump administration have fervently said that they will not allow patient protections such as pre-existing conditions, of course, $1 million caps, those types of things that truly, for at least the hemophilia community, were the cornerstone of the ACA. They will not let those things go by the wayside if the ACA gets completely repealed. However, what is very troubling, we have not seen any healthcare plan. We haven't seen any policy. All we've seen is rhetoric, just saying this. And so as an advocacy point of view going into the election, each Congress member, not only your presidential election choices, but to really question, what is their plan if this goes away? What is if the Democrats win, what is the Democratic plan if this goes away? And I think it's a many layered discussion, classic, national politics and our healthcare system is so complex that is another layer to this conversation in terms of what is the plan if this thing goes away, in particular for our community. And no one has really stated that, especially on the Republican side. So it'll be interesting to follow that conversation as well.
I would hope that the debate that's in less than a week, I hope that that's a question. I mean, it feels like with this coming up right the week after the election, that you would hope both candidates would be able to speak to what the plan would be if the outcome is not favorable. And by favorable, I mean for the ACA.
Yeah.
It definitely... what gave me a little bit of peace too is there's like a couple of this guy who's mentioned in 2 of my articles, Jonathan Adler. I don't know if he was mentioned in either of your articles, but he's a libertarian law professor at Case Western Reserve University here in Cleveland, Ohio. And he's anti-ACA, and he's still he states that he thinks the lawsuit and the Republican argument is absurd. So this is a guy
Yeah.
who's not for the ACA, who is a libertarian and is a law professor, and he just doesn't think this holds water. But, like you both have stated, and this year being what it is, and historical precedents not really holding water. And so, us all being in a state of like not being able to count on what has historically happened in the past happening again. Yeah, it's uncertain for sure.
I agree with you. And I think because of this conversation, healthcare, politically, healthcare, we haven't talked about healthcare a lot. There's been a lot of other things that have held national conversation. And hopefully healthcare becomes a main cornerstone of this election.
Well, actually, and Amy, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said exactly that on This Week, one of the Sunday shows, that the Affordable Care Act is now going to be placed front and center. How this is just another example of how the president doesn't want to crush the virus that we're dealing with. He wants to crush the Affordable Care Act protecting people. So I expect that you're onto something with wondering if healthcare is going to be something that gets a little more airtime than it has in recent months.
And for community members listening who might, all of a sudden, I don't know, feel rising anxiety about this, which I get, the process, just to kind of like layman's term, the process, oral arguments begin November 10th, and they will continue throughout the winter, and the decision will likely come early 2021. So in terms of what we can do as an advocacy community, obviously we can't lobby members of Congress for this, or even, our higher, the Trump administration or the Biden administration, depending on the election. This is, the Supreme Court. So NHF will be submitting public comment in terms of what we believe for a hemophilia community once oral arguments begin. So to stay attuned to that, I would recommend probably staying close to your social media channels. HFA is actually really wonderful in terms of communicating what their policy directives are, public statements, those things. And so they work so closely with NHF that we will be able to kind of hear what the hemophilia community is doing probably through social media. And if something sparks where we need, public voice, I'm sure you will hear that from your national organizations or your regional chapters. So just FYI on the process.
And if there's anything of particular import, we will, of course, be bringing it up here on Bloodstream as well. Amy, Natalie, thank you for putting in the homework to give us a nice informed discussion there. Of course, we could continue for much longer, but we can't. So instead, I will say thank you to Genentech for making this segment possible. Remind you to visit genentechhemophilia.com to check out those 2 new great videos that feature magician and comedian Justin Willman. All right, let's get into the conversation that I had just a little while ago with our friend, Dr. Mike Callahan.
All right, joining me now from the Cheat Codes podcast, amongst other places, but that's our preferred title here, is Dr. Mike Callahan. Dr. Mike, how are you?
I'm doing well. Good to talk with you, Patrick. How are you doing?
Always, pretty well. As I was just sharing with you off mic for a moment, this past weekend I was dealing with a little bit of hemophilia-related pain and arthritic pain, but that's par for the course. But if I'm being honest, that was part of my weekend, and it was a little bit frustrating.
Yeah, never good.
Never good, but it's just part of what it means.
I feel like we've gotten better at preventing bleeding, but now everybody thinks we need to replace all their joints with new undamaged ones. So let's start working on that.
Yeah, there's a whole topic right there. We'll save that for another day. So I want to talk to you about sickle cell because it is Sickle Cell Awareness Month. So that's important. But before we get into sickle cell related topics, first, a few things within the hemophilia and bleeding disorders world. Most notably, last month we had the news from the FDA that BioMarin's product was not going to be approved, that there was more data that was being asked for. So as a place to start, that was pretty big news and something that many people that FDA decision was a big milestone on many people's calendars in one way or another. So what did it mean for you when that news broke?
Yeah, so I'm an investigator on the study, and I've been involved in gene therapy research for a few years, and we've been excited about the possibility, and it seemed like it was getting really close. So it feels like a setback a little bit, but I also see what they're doing there. I mean, I think they said, we've got 4 years of data now on 7 patients, but that's it. And then we've got this phase 3 study, but some of the people aren't even a year out yet. So we want more data. And I think, that's a good role for FDA. And, we want gene therapy to come out, but we want it to be ready, and we want it to be safe, and we want it to be effective. And, the bar is pretty high. We've got good treatments right now. So it made sense to me. Did feel like a little bit of a setback, but we'll keep moving forward and, keep making gene therapy better.
And shortly thereafter, there was an article published that had a number of authors whose names will be recognized by busy people within the bleeding disorders world, people like Brian O'Mahony, Mark Skinner, Glenn Pierce, amongst others. And it was an article that was essentially questioning, and please quibble with my word choice here, Dr. Mike, if you would like, but essentially questioning, are we doing enough to scientifically vet some of the unknowns that exist? Are we looking at things like the core heme guidelines that were established to give ourselves some kind of bar for outcomes as we are looking at what data ought to be collected and what pieces of the known unknowns to prioritize? I have to say I was kind of surprised by the urgent tone that the piece took. What was your take?
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised too, but I like the concept of it, and that's been going on for a little while. And it's a lot of patient advocates and people who are really involved in the community, I think, taking the lead on this. And I think it's great because in hemophilia, we've gotten to a pretty good place. We have a lot of good, safe treatments, and we've been using annualized bleeding rate as the outcome measure on trials for quite a while. And when that gets really low, it starts to not make sense that that's what is our outcome measure. If you're comparing a treatment and one of them's got a 0 ABR and the other one's got a 0 ABR, what's the difference?
Right.
And so I think you have to get into these things and decide what should be the best outcome measures. And I think when things are really effective like that, safety is an important outcome measure, and really quality of life is an important outcome measure. So I think that's what that group's been saying for a long time is, we need better tools to dig into the data from these trials and capture more data from these trials about things that are going to meaningfully differentiate these things and make sure that they're safe and effective. And unfortunately, it's hard to do it after the trials are over. It's harder to capture high quality data. So I think there is a very positive move to incorporate those things early. And I haven't dug into QOL and core heme that deeply, but it seems like they've put a really comprehensive framework together.
Yes, that's my take, and I'm similarly not deeply familiar with it, but it seems as though it's quite comprehensive and has been well vetted. Does do any of the, I hesitate to even call them flags, but I guess do any of the pieces that they underscored, things like AAV integration, do any of those elements that we either don't have much data on or don't have any data on yet, do any of those have particular cause for concern for you?
I'm not particularly concerned about any of it. I mean, I think we have now hundreds of patients on these gene therapies, and we've pleasantly not seen big safety signals. There were on a neurology gene therapy with a really high dose AAV, 2 bad outcomes recently. And I think, we, with any new platform, we have to be really diligent. And but I've been reading this Black Swan book, and I think it's true that, we're always fighting last battle. So, COVID hits, and now we're going to be planning for the next COVID for the next 20 years, but it's going to be something we didn't expect that comes and gets us. And I think that's true with a lot of these trials. I think the things that we know about and that we're tracking, I think have been, pleasantly a surprise, but we always have to be open to the idea that there could be something that we don't know about. In terms of the integration, there are some papers from mice and there are some mouse specific issues that made those papers probably not applicable to adults. And I think the concern you always have with something really new like this is you're not going to know what happens 20 years down the road till 20 years down the road.
Right.
And
There's
we
just no
don't.
way to
So,
get that.
and for some of these things, I think the ask has been, can we get liver biopsies and look at what's going on in the liver tissue? And this is a hard thing because you're putting somebody on a study and you're getting a liver biopsy, not because it's going to help them. You're getting it to get more information about the treatment. And so from a human investigation committee ethics, that's a big ask. That's saying, we're going to put you at risk of a liver biopsy for people's general knowledge, not because it applies to you. And I think, it's something we probably should do. I think there's a lot of brave people who volunteer for these studies who, if it was an option, would choose to do that option, even though it's an invasive procedure for them. And I think we do need to know, is there integration, but we won't know for a long time what that means. I think, there's a lot of questions with any new treatment, and it's impossible to prove a negative. So when you're saying, is it safe? Well, we've got hundreds of people and it's been safe so far, but could there be something we're not expecting, something that happens 10, 20, 30 years down the road? You can't prove that's not true until you get there.
Right.
And hopefully it's not true, but we won't know. So I think doing, the most comprehensive study, I think having the closest follow-up we can is the best way to answer those things.
And do you feel like there's been enough transparency in general in the studies?
Yeah, I think this is always a huge challenge, and social media has made it. Shout out to Dr. Z Sickle Cell, who loves social media and is so involved. But it's made it a challenge for us doing studies, because it used to be that you had a data safety monitoring board, which were experts in the field who got all of the safety data and reviewed it in a thorough, methodical way with statisticians and tried to figure out if there was a safety signal there that needed to be addressed. And then, you could put together the transparent message to get all the information out around that. What happens a lot now is, before I even get the safety report from the company, I'm seeing about this thing on Facebook.
Right.
And there's a lot of back and forth, and nobody has enough information. So the company's trying to respond, but they don't even have all of the information yet. And then people are saying, oh, well, you're not giving us all the information. You're not being transparent. So I feel for the companies. And then it becomes almost, like a political thing. And it's a little bit challenging. So I think, it's important for the companies to be as transparent as possible, but I think it's also important for us as treaters and as patients to realize these are clinical trials. These are why you're doing the trials. It's not an FDA available thing, so you're not really making a decision about whether you want to go on this yet. So we need to give them time to, get all of the data and present it in a fair and balanced way, which is sometimes not possible, with these Facebook posts.
Right.
So I think, we also have to hold their feet to the fire, because there are situations where I think definitely things don't come out and are not as transparent as they should be. And I think it's not so much in these high profile cases like gene therapy or, whatever is the hottest clinical trial. Those ones are all over Facebook.
Getting
but
a lot
the
of
ones
attention
you haven't heard of, a lot of times there's things on there that probably need to be dealt with more transparently and really studied more. And we don't hear about it, or it doesn't become a high profile issue and can get a little bit buried. And so I think it's important for us to keep an eye on all of those things, especially as new drugs come out, to go back through the trial and say, oh, what about this? Do we know enough about it?
Well, and so to that point, and then I do want to ask you some sickle cell specific questions, but we did recently see some additional Hemlibra data that was published, real world data, so what we get after the clinical trial, but only once the clinical trial has come to an end and the thing is commercially available, so therein lies the rub. But there are also, as we know, many other treatment options in bleeding disorders, and there are also things being looked into that are not to do with monoclonal antibodies or viral vectors, but there are things being done to improve what factor can do for a patient. So with all of this kind of swirling now, how does this, if at all, alter your view on the treatment landscape as we're in, moving toward the end of 2020?
Yeah, I mean, it's been for years now and continues to be such an exciting time for hemophilia. I think in terms of the real world data question, I think that's always really important. It's got its challenges because they're basically observational studies. So you're not randomizing the same group of people to one treatment or another, which is a powerful way to be able to detect changes and see how treatments are working and detect side effects. But you do have all of the things that happen in real life that you maybe don't have in a study. So in studies, we often put on patients who we know are really compliant. They're going to show up for their appointments. They're going to take the medicine. They're going to.
Right.
So what happens then when you get this out into the real world and it's somebody who's not so good about that stuff? Does that change how well it works? Or do you start to see side effects because people missed a dose or doubled up a dose on accident or things that wouldn't happen in a trial? And you have a lot more people and a lot more time. So I saw a couple of studies, one from Israel and one from a group out of Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and Children's National, like Leslie Ruffini, Mike Guerrera, that group. And I think the nice thing is that the data they're seeing is really a lot like what we saw in the clinical trials. The other thing you get is things that happen, right? So in real life, people have heart attacks, and
Sure.
if they have heart attacks and they're on a new drug, you have to wonder, is it because of that new drug? But you don't have a control group to compare it to. You don't have pristine collection of data in a standardized way. So
Right.
it becomes really hard to say, is this just one of those things that would have happened whether they were on that drug or not? Is it because of the drug? And again, in Facebook world, this becomes a really challenging thing.
And Dr. Mike, I don't mean to interrupt you, but just
Uh-huh.
this is interesting too. What's the rule or the law around deaths that have to be reported if someone was on a clinical trial? To your point about it could have been maybe that heart attack had something to do with a drug, maybe not. Isn't it correct that, like, to a certain extent, all patient deaths have to be reported whether or not we believe it had anything to do with the drug that they were on if they were on a clinical trial?
Yeah, if you're on a clinical trial, that all gets reported. And also the person who's taking care of the patient. So if it's a patient who's on the trial at my site, I would provide information to the study about what happened. And at the end of it, I have to make a determination where I say, I think this was possibly because of the study drug, or I don't think this had anything to do with the study drug. But it's really just my opinion about the event that happened. So it doesn't mean that, because a lot of times the companies will say, and the investigators didn't think it was because of the study drug.
Right.
And, we take that very seriously. It's an important responsibility. And I think, you try to err on the side of caution. So if it could be because of the study drug, then that's what you say. But at the end of the day, that's what it is. Once a drug is launched and it's FDA approved, none of that needs to be reported. But if the company hears about it, they have an obligation to report it to FDA. So if there are events that they, have been attributed to their drug. So for instance, if on this podcast we said, drug X, I had a patient who had an allergic reaction to it and this happened, then the company who owns drug X, if they heard our podcast, would have to try to contact me and get more information about that and report it. But if we don't talk about that, then it just happened and nobody knows.
Interesting.
And there are things like, for instance, every person who goes into the hospital with a heart attack takes aspirin. Like they give them some aspirin to try to stop the heart attack. And then, of course, a lot of people are going to have a bad outcome from their heart attack. And so if you reported every time a patient died who just took aspirin, you would have a ton of them. And you might say, oh, boy, aspirin causes heart attack deaths. But really, it's an observational study. And because they had a heart attack, they got the aspirin. So in these kind of, phase 4 out in the market kind of observational things, it's really hard to tease apart if something is because of a drug, unless it's something that's really incredibly rare that you wouldn't expect to see, or it's happening a whole lot more frequently than you would expect to see in a population.
Right.
And so things that happen a lot are really hard to see. If a few people tell you they had a headache, lots of people have headaches. It could just be a coincidence.
Right.
If people tell you they have transverse myelitis, like happened in the vaccine study in England, that's a pretty rare thing. There's only one of them, so it could just be a coincidence still. But if you saw 4 of those, you'd say there's no way that could be chance. That had to be because of the study thing. So
yeah, that makes good sense.
So I think that's one of the reasons it's important to do really good clinical trials up front, because capturing these things afterwards is really a challenge.
And it goes back to what we were saying with the urgency around the letter that those advocates wrote. This is the time during the clinical trial to be getting this good data. This is the time. All right, so let's talk some sickle cell. We are in Sickle Cell Awareness Month. What are some of the goals and particulars of Sickle Cell Awareness Month here in September of 2020?
Yeah, so sickle cell, like hemophilia, it's a really exciting time for sickle cell. We have 2 new drugs last year. There's gene therapy in the pipeline. There's a lot of other new medications. Sickle cell, unlike hemophilia, hasn't had good treatment. And there are really a tremendous number of challenges in sickle cell. So I think a lot of awareness in sickle cell is making sure people have access to the treatment that they need. And that's those new drugs, but it's also just having a doctor, getting care that you need in the emergency room, which is a really tremendous challenge for a lot of our sickle cell warriors. And so I think goals for Sickle Cell Awareness Month are really to get out the word about that, and try to push initiatives like people who are having sickle cell pain crises need to get their medicine in the ER within an hour.
Yeah, what are some of the either data or stories that best capture what the sickle cell patient's experience typically is when they show up at an ER?
Yeah, so, it of course variable, but the challenge is you have a huge population of patients who are mostly African American and going into the emergency room in pain. And I think the same is true with people with hemophilia who have joint pain. And it can be a challenge to get people to recognize that, pain is an emergency and that you need help with your pain. And I think there's been a lot of, really good energy around the opioid crisis and trying to find ways to keep people from becoming addicted to pain medicines.
Right.
But this is not our problem in sickle cell.
Right.
We have people with a chronic severe pain condition with severe exacerbations who really need narcotics. The addiction rate is pretty low. And so our problem is we have very few overdoses. So our problem is really about, having people recognize that this isn't where you want to, make a stand against the opioid crisis.
Right.
This is where you want to, really listen to patients and trust what they're saying and treat them appropriately.
Yes.
And so that's a big challenge. And people with sickle cell pain is one big issue, but organ damage, strokes, kidney failure, avascular necrosis of the bones, leg ulcers, pulmonary hypertension. There are so many complications of sickle cell, and they accumulate over a lifetime. And we started looking at the National Inpatient Survey hospital data, and the average age of death for people with sickle cell in the hospital was in the early mid-40s. For the general population of African Americans, it was about 63. For the general population in the U.S., it was about 72. So even in 2020, with the tools we have, people with sickle cell are living vastly shortened lives and lots of complications and quality of life issues. And so I think we want to make awareness about that and really
for sure
drive strategies to improve that.
And I know on Cheat Codes, you and Dr. Zadie on the Cheat Codes podcast are often talking about breakthroughs, news events, things that are top of mind or ought to be on the short list of priorities for people affected by sickle cell. What's been going on lately on Cheat Codes? What do you have coming up? What are some of the topics that you and Dr. Zaidi are particularly focused on at the moment?
Yeah, so we will have very shortly an episode with Dr. Wally Smith, who's one of my heroes. And Dr. Smith is internist, but he's focused his whole career on taking care of people with sickle cell and has really developed a great program in Virginia with lots of healthcare navigators. And so we talked to Wally, and I think that's going to be a great episode. We're looking forward to having some people from the Department of Health and Human Services. And once we have it all locked down and they're in the can, I'll be more transparent about that.
But that was a great tease, though.
Really,
that was a
really
great
exciting
tease.
guests. We've had a lot of advocates on, and really scientists who make breakthroughs. And I think the focus is on teaching people about sickle cell, and there's a little bit of social commentary and hopefully a little bit of humor in there.
So that's the Cheat Codes podcast, part of Bloodstream Media, bloodstreammedia.com, or you can find the Cheat Codes podcast on your favorite podcast player. Final question, and I know we're up against the clock here. I appreciate your time today, Dr. Mike. But as we know, just this past weekend, there was a very high-profile death on the Supreme Court, which led to a vacancy that will now be discussed ad nauseum until it is no longer vacant. But as it specifically pertains to the Affordable Care Act, there is a challenge coming in front of the Supreme Court just after Election Day, which means if this vacancy is filled before there is a new president, that person will have a voice in how that case plays out. And if not, then the next justice will. Can you talk? I don't want to get into the politics of it because this isn't the place for that. But can we talk just for a moment about what does the Affordable Care Act mean for patients with hemophilia, patients with sickle cell, these patients with rare chronic blood disorders, and if it were to be overturned or gutted beyond repair, what could that mean for these patients and families?
Yeah, so, specifically, the Affordable Care Act got rid of caps on insurance, which was huge for people with really high cost disorders like hemophilia. So prior to that, you might have an insurance policy that said, after you spend $2 million, you're done. We can't cover you anymore, which meant that people were having to jump between jobs to keep insured, which is ridiculous. And I think if I can take a step back from this, it's important that we protect all of those provisions. But boy, we have a stupid healthcare system. I mean, it's a mess. And, the Affordable Care Act fixed a couple of the problems like that, but there's just so many things that are a problem now. I mean, we have an issue, people with hemophilia have extremely costly medical care. And I understand why we have high deductible policies and you want people to have skin in the game and, make medical decisions considering the cost of them.
Sure.
I think, in an ideal system, you maybe wouldn't need to do that, but you can have people frivolously spending money. So I get it. I get why they put those things into place. But if you have a disorder where every year you're going to get hit with an exorbitant cost, it's so ridiculous, unfair, and it creates extra costs down the road. So it's not even effective at lowering costs. And, for all of our people with hemophilia and now with sickle cell, that's become a huge issue. And some of the manufacturers came in and said, well, let's see if we can help you. If this is going to be a financial burden to you, we can maybe come in and help with the copays. Well, now some of the insurance companies are coming back and saying, okay, we'll take their money, but we're not going to count that against your copay. We're going to come back at you again the next month with the copay. Mm-hmm. So it just makes the company's program really not valuable anymore.
Right.
And it's dumb. It's really penalizing people for having a costly disorder every year without changing the way people are spending healthcare dollars at all. So, unfortunately, some of that was because of ACA. So there was a lot of great things about ACA, but these high deductible plans came in because of that. So I think, it's ridiculous to me that you have 9 people who are going to decide major things like this about the healthcare of, people throughout the country. And I think some of that is how we got into this really stupid healthcare system we have. So I hope, the caps provision and the fact that pre-existing conditions don't eliminate you from getting care stay in our healthcare policy. But boy, I hope we can fix all this other dumb stuff and really take it out of the hands of a small handful of people and bring it back to where all of us have a voice and we can take care of each other. And some of that is, there are a lot of pieces of healthcare that are not value add, that are extremely expensive. I'm not going to name any $13 million CEOs of hospitals, but there are a lot of places we could cut costs and improve the system. And I think, regardless of what happens in the Supreme Court, we have to start doing that. We all have to. I mean, it's not working for anybody. So.
Dr. Mike Callahan of the Comprehensive Sickle Cell Center at the Children's Hospital of Detroit, and one half, along with Dr. Marzadi of the Cheat Codes Sickle Cell Podcast, part of Bloodstream Media, bloodstreammedia.com. Dr. Mike, appreciate your time and expertise, and I'm sure we'll talk again very soon.
Thanks for having me on, Patrick. Nice talking with you.
Always a pleasure. Take care. Thank you, Dr. Mike, and listeners, buckle up. This is a nerd alert moment. But after the interview with Dr. Mike, I found myself thinking more about that gene therapy article that was published by a number of adult men whom were all born with hemophilia. And I thought, I listen to a number of podcasts that read articles or excerpts from articles that I myself am never actually going to go read. I think this one's pretty important. I thought the conversation with Dr. Mike underscored that it does stand out in its tone and specificity. And therefore, I thought maybe I would just read the article here for you all. It's a dense article. It's brief. It's about a 9-minute read. So if you are not at all interested in this, you skip ahead to 9 minutes. You'll hear the final segment with Amy, Natalie, and I. But if you are interested, I'm going to go ahead and just read as best I can, forgive any mispronunciations. This article first published September 10th, 2020, titled Gene Therapy to Cure Hemophilia is Robust Scientific Inquiry, the Missing Factor, and I found it off of the Wiley Online Library. A short preamble states that the authors of this article were all born with severe hemophilia and are widely published in the field and frequently lecture on related topics. They are and have been leaders at national and international levels, including the World Federation of Hemophilia, the European Hemophilia Consortium, the Irish Hemophilia Society, the Canadian Hemophilia Society, the National Hemophilia Foundation, and Polish Hemophilia Society. One of us was cured of hemophilia through a liver transplant for end-stage HCV-induced cirrhosis. One was recently treated with a gene therapy vector and is now free of clotting factor concentrate usage. And the other 4 are patiently waiting to make the commitment to seek a cure. Most of us have been through the infectious disease wars as patients, advocates, activists, and self-treaters. The article starts, hemophilia, a rare inherited bleeding disorder, is caused by a defect in the factor 8 or factor 9 gene, leaving people with hemophilia at significant risk of spontaneous bleeding and resultant severe pain, joint disease, disability, and premature death. From our earliest memories, we, all men born with severe hemophilia, have dreamed of a cure. We witnessed many false starts beginning in the 1990s through the 2000s, until the first hint of effectively ameliorating our phenotypes appeared. Development of the factor 9 Padua mutation, offering 5-fold to 7-fold higher specific activity, and recent factor 8 trials have allowed the possibility that severe hemophiliac phenotype really could be changed to mild or even normal. The biology of introducing adeno-associated virus vector, AAV, delivering a coagulation factor into humans has fallen far behind in the phenomenologic changes in phenotypes. With gene therapy, a change from severe to mild or normal phenotypes is a major accomplishment, but a discriminating review of the data is unsettling. A framework of known unknown questions has been developed, which remain largely unanswered, despite the fact that large-scale clinical trials are moving towards completion. For the first time in hemophilia, a core outcome set for gene therapies has been developed, CoreHeme, with the involvement of patients, clinicians, researchers, drug developers, regulators, and payers. Patient involvement ensured that efficacy outcomes were both meaningful and relevant to those living with hemophilia. Core outcomes also include safety events required as per good clinical practice and regulatory guidance, including liver toxicity, immune responses to transgene and capsid, thrombosis, development of other disorders, vector integration into host genome, duration of vector neutralizing responses, and cause of death. These efficacy and safety outcomes were relevant when they were adopted and remain so as gene therapy nears the market. In our view, circulating factor level is the key determinant in the success of gene therapy. Regarding safety, mildly elevated transaminases, oh boy, this is where the mispronunciations get me. Regarding safety, mildly elevated transaminases, you'll have to look that up yourself, have been largely dismissed because the increases are mostly transient. This ignores the cause and whether there is ongoing low-level liver damage, analogous to what our community has seen with hepatitis C. Are we taking AAV-induced liver inflammation as seriously as a one-and-done therapy that cannot be withdrawn should dictate? Safety considerations are once again paramount, with the very recent report of deaths following liver complications of 2 children on an AAV gene therapy trial for X-linked myotubular myopathy. Another safety aspect, largely discounted, is low-level AAV integration. While significantly less efficient at integration than lentiviruses or retroviruses, given the trillions to quadrillions of vector genomes dosed, millions of integrations into the liver and elsewhere nevertheless occur. Additionally, no data have been published about the possible impact on an innate immune response of an adventitious virus, which persists in insect cell lines used to manufacture some AAV vectors. When there is a lack of scientific consensus, we should not allow a rush to commercialization to unduly influence decisions. Where there is known uncertainty, such as integration, foundational research should be undertaken. The HIV epidemic in people with hemophilia analogizes our concerns regarding decision-making and the precautionary principle. We recognize that uncertainty is unavoidable. Some questions cannot be fully answered pre-market. The numerous uncertainties, however, highlight the importance of a global longitudinal surveillance registry to capture outcomes for all people with hemophilia undergoing gene therapy. Clotting factor levels considerably above the normal upper limits were observed in some patients with factor VIII and factor IX studies. This calls into question reliability and variability and underscores the importance of full safety data disclosure by all sponsors. All hemophilia gene therapy trials have had participants at the low and high ends of response, with ranges of 6-fold to greater than 10-fold. Identifying the causes of inter- and intra-individual variability has not been a research priority, yet finding root causes of the variability might permit potential mitigants to be identified. Mitigation would include searching for intravenous ranges. Mitigation would include searching for interventions ranging from AAV manufacture to vector infusion to final protein secretion from the hepatocytes. Variability may or may not be related to durability. Published factor IX data suggest stable expression for at least 8 years. Canine data for factor VIII suggests stable lifetime expression. A human trial, however, shows a loss of factor VIII from the end of year 1 to year 4. Other sponsors have released no long-term data. Much more research is needed to understand the reasons for this decline. Decreases in bleeding and factor utilization will follow rises in clotting factor activity, and thus factor VIII or factor IX activity is a quantitative discriminant for gene therapy success. Since factor levels are dropping in some individuals, there has been a movement to disregard the levels and look only at bleeding rates and factor usage. This is a revisionist and unacceptable solution to establishing efficacy of gene therapy. These issues demonstrate that the knowledge of the biology of AAV gene therapy has not kept pace with advancing clinical studies. We ask, do we have a safe, reliable product to give us the sustained cure we are awaiting? Perhaps not quite. Our expectations are mismatched to the reality of the available data. Unresolved issues make the decision of whether or not to undergo gene therapy difficult for people with hemophilia. knowing this world does not include those seropositive from prior natural AAV infection eligibility. What factor level would one achieve? Reliability, variability. Not knowing how long expression will last, durability. Whether the result will make one independent of clotting factor, quality of life, transformational independence, resource requirements, the likely inability to take a second AAV gene therapy if the first dose is inadequate, redosing, the impact of both liver inflammation and integration, safety, ethical considerations, both pre-marketing and post-marketing, including robust education and discussion of the knowns, unknowns, and alternative treatment options before or after gene therapy, remain of paramount importance. The informed consent process and process once these products are marketed should include a well-structured framework of shared decision-making between healthcare providers and patients. This is an urgent reminder while gene therapy is under clinical investigation. We need more transparency from all those pursuing clinical trials, including meaningful research on the unanswered questions around safety, variability, and durability of response. Only in this environment, we can have confidence in this technology. A global registry is a vital and necessary foundation for tracking safety and efficacy, but observational studies alone do not substitute for scientific investigations to further our biologic knowledge of this new and promising therapeutic modality. All right, there you have it. The link, again, is in the program notes. The article titled, Gene Therapy to Cure Hemophilia, Is Robust Scientific Inquiry the Missing Factor?
All right, and as we are on our way home to this, at the end of this segment, actually, speaking of on our way home, Natalie, we are almost on our way home. By the time this episode airs, we're a day away from returning to California after, I think, the longest stint I've spent out of my home in like 10 years. I don't know.
I thought you guys were just going to be permanently in Ohio.
I mean, we're not on the plane yet.
It definitely felt that way. Yeah, a month in Ohio. But I'm ready to go home. I'm ready to sleep in our bed, and now that the smoke is cleared and the fires are being contained at least a little bit, it'll be nice to return back to sunny California.
So, Amy, that's our weekend. What are you up to this weekend?
Well, California story. We are in the process of looking for a house to rent for the first time. So we're like house shopping, which is great and just ragingly anxiety inducing. Oh my gosh. It's really intense. But yeah, so that's what we're doing.
All right. Well, good luck with it. I hope you find some gems
in a pandemic. Looking at houses in a pandemic. It's crazy.
Whatever happens on that house hunt, whatever happens with us on Saturday, which is hopefully getting on a plane, we will be back next Friday with another episode. But for now, that is all for this episode. Special thanks to everyone at Bloodstream Media and Believe Limited who make the Bloodstream podcast possible. Thanks as well to our presenting sponsor, Takeda, bleedingdisorders.com to learn more, and our segment sponsor, Genentech, genentechhemophilia.com to learn more and watch those videos with Justin Willman. Subscribe to the Bloodstream podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave us a rating in the Apple Store. Share this episode with a friend. Word of mouth is the best way we can reach new people. Do you have a topic you would like to hear us discuss? Want to hear us read a bunch of articles somewhat well? Well, then you can share your ideas. Email us, mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You can connect with us on social media. How about that? Bloodstream Media is on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or you can find Amy, Natalie, and me. You could just do that on your own time. Reminder to check out the show notes for this episode in your podcast player or on bloodstreammedia.com, where you'll find links and information related to the segments and stories featured on this episode. Until next time, I'm your host, Patrick James Lynch, alongside wife and co-host,
Natalie Lynch,
and Believe's Director of Outreach,
Amy Board.
We'll be back next week with another great episode, and until then, take self-care of yourself. Bye, everybody.